Greetings, fellow veterans. Granny asked me to cover this subject. She figured I have served enough tours in Desert Storm, and as a Black Hawk pilot, I should know enough about being exposed to toxins. She and I served together. She and Grandpa are dear friends of mine. I'm Lieutenant Michael Wong, United States Armed Forces. My journey to this uniform started as a kid who loved solving puzzles and helping others. Today, I stand here not just as a former officer but as someone who believes in teamwork, integrity, and service to the community. I'm here to educate you on the PACT Act. Thank you for welcoming me. Together, we can accomplish this mission. The PACT Act enhances the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, ability to provide healthcare and disability benefits to veterans who were exposed to toxic substances during their service. It also ensures that veterans receive a presumptive connection for conditions linked to these exposures, which simplifies the claims process. Here are some key components of the PACT Act. This bill expanded eligibility for VA healthcare. Veterans exposed to toxic substances, including burn pits and other environmental hazards, can access VA healthcare. This includes veterans of specific service eras who were previously ineligible for VA healthcare. Presumptive conditions. Certain illnesses are automatically presumed to be service-connected if the veteran served in specific locations and time frames. Veterans do not need to prove a direct link between their service and the condition to receive benefits. Expanded locations of exposure. The Act broadens the geographic and area-based criteria for presumed exposure to toxic substances. Comprehensive care for survivors. Families of veterans who died from conditions related to toxic exposure may now be eligible for dependency and indemnity compensation, DIC. Research and accountability. Increase funding and mandates for research into the effects of toxic exposures, and improve tracking and reporting of veterans' health data. Now, we will go over who is covered under the PACT Act. The PACT Act applies to veterans who served in locations or operations where exposure to toxic substances was likely. The key groups include post-9/11 veterans, veterans who served in Iraq, Afghanistan, or other locations where burn pits were used, operations involving exposure to airborne hazards, Vietnam War veterans, veterans who served in areas exposed to Agent Orange, including Vietnam, January 9, 1962 to May 7, 1975. Thailand, certain military bases. Laos and Cambodia, specific periods. Johnston Atoll, 1972 to 1973. Gulf War and post-Gulf War veterans. Veterans who served in areas of known toxic exposure in the Gulf War era, including the Persian Gulf region and Somalia. Other groups include veterans who may have been exposed to radiation, contaminated water, example, at Camp Lejeune, or other environmental hazards. The PACT Act of 2022 extends significant benefits to post-9/11 veterans who were exposed to toxic substances during their service. This group largely includes veterans who served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations where burn pits and hazardous environments were prevalent. This covers the timeframe of after the 9/11 attacks to current. Locations of exposure include Iraq, including Operations Iraqi Freedom and Inherent Resolve, Afghanistan, including Operation Enduring Freedom, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, Syria, Jordan, Djibouti, Egypt, certain locations and operations. Naval and airspace areas. Veterans who served aboard ships in the Persian Gulf or who worked in airspace operations in these theaters. Burn pit exposure. Burn pits were commonly used for waste disposal in many deployment zones, creating toxic smoke and fumes. Veterans who served in or near these zones may have been exposed to harmful chemicals. Veterans who served in the previously noted locations and developed specific illnesses or conditions are granted a presumption of service connection. This eliminates the need to prove the condition is related to their military service. Respiratory conditions. Chronic bronchitis. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. Chronic rhinitis. Chronic sinusitis. Constrictive bronchiolitis or obliterative bronchiolitis. Emphysema. Granulomatous disease. Interstitial lung disease. Pleuritis. Pulmonary fibrosis. Sarcoidosis. Cancers. Brain cancer. Gastrointestinal cancer. Head and neck cancer. Kidney cancer. Lymphatic cancer. Lymphoma. Melanoma. Pancreatic cancer. Reproductive cancers like ovarian and testicular cancer. Respiratory cancers like lung and esophageal cancer. Veterans who served in specific locations during designated time frames are presumed to have been exposed to Agent Orange or other herbicides. Republic of Vietnam. Service period, January 9, 1962 to May 7, 1975. Applies to veterans who served on the ground in Vietnam or within its inland waterways, boots on the ground, or brown water veterans. Blue Water Navy veterans. Service period, January 9, 1962 to May 7, 1975. Includes veterans who served aboard ships within 12 nautical miles of the coast of Vietnam. Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. Service period, September 1, 1967 to August 31, 1971. Veterans who served in units operating along the Korean DMZ, where Agent Orange was used. Thailand military bases. Service period, January 9, 1962 to May 7, 1975. Applies to veterans whose duties placed them near base perimeters where herbicides were sprayed, including bases like Tidorn, Tokli, Yuban, and others. Laos and Cambodia. Service period, December 1, 1965 to September 30, 1969. Specifically, areas near the Ho Chi Minh Trail where herbicides were sprayed. Johnston Atoll. Service period, January 1, 1972 to September 30, 1977. Veterans involved in the storage or disposal of Agent Orange on this island. The VA presumes certain illnesses are service-connected due to Agent Orange exposure. Veterans with these conditions are eligible for disability compensation without needing to prove a direct service connection. Cancers. Chronic B-cell leukemia. Hodgkin's disease. Multiple myeloma. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Prostate cancer. Respiratory cancers, lung, bronchus, larynx, trachea. Soft tissue sarcomas, except osteosarcoma, chondrosarcoma, Kaposi's sarcoma, or mesothelioma. Other serious illnesses. AL amyloidosis. Chloracne, or similar acneiform disease. Diabetes mellitus type 2. Ischemic heart disease. Parkinson's disease. Peripheral neuropathy, early onset. Porphyria cutanea tarda. Hypertension. Recently added under the PACT Act, recognizing the link between Agent Orange exposure and high blood pressure. Monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, MGUS. A blood condition that can lead to more serious diseases like multiple myeloma. Veterans who served in the following regions during the specified dates are presumed to have been exposed to hazardous substances. Southwest Asia Theater of Operations. Countries included: Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, the neutral zone between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Oman, Gulf of Aden, Gulf of Oman, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, Red Sea. The VA recognizes a range of undiagnosed illnesses, medically unexplained chronic multi-symptom illnesses, MUCMIs, and specific diseases as presumptive conditions. Undiagnosed illnesses, Gulf War syndrome. Symptoms lasting 6 months or more that cannot be attributed to a specific diagnosis. Includes a combination of the following symptoms: fatigue, skin rashes, headaches, muscle or joint pain, neurological symptoms, respiratory issues, sleep disturbances, gastrointestinal problems, example, irritable bowel syndrome. Medically unexplained chronic multi-symptom illnesses, MUCMIs. Defined as conditions without a clear cause or consistent medical diagnosis, including chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, functional gastrointestinal disorders, example, irritable bowel syndrome. Specific presumptive diseases. The VA presumes these conditions are service-connected for Gulf War veterans. Infectious diseases. Malaria, brucellosis, Campylobacter jejuni, Coxiella burnetii, Q fever, non-typhoidal salmonella, Shigella, Leishmaniasis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, West Nile virus. Respiratory conditions. Expanded under the PACT Act for exposure to burn pits and airborne toxins. Asthma, chronic bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, chronic rhinitis, chronic sinusitis, emphysema, interstitial lung disease, pulmonary fibrosis, cancers, brain cancer, head and neck cancers, respiratory cancers, example, lung cancer, gastrointestinal cancers, reproductive cancers, lymphatic cancers. Veterans who were exposed to ionizing radiation during their military service are known as radiation-exposed veterans. The VA provides presumptive service connection for specific diseases associated with exposure to ionizing radiation under certain circumstances. These veterans are eligible for benefits without the need to prove that their condition is directly linked to their military service. Veterans qualify as radiation exposed if they participated in specific activities or served in certain locations during designated time frames, including participation in atmospheric nuclear testing. Time frame 1945 to 1962. Veterans who participated in atmospheric nuclear tests, which included above-ground nuclear detonations. Occupation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Time frame August 6, 1945 to July 1, 1946. Veterans who served in or near Hiroshima or Nagasaki, Japan, during the U.S. occupation after the atomic bombings. POW exposure. Time frame World War II. Prisoners of war, POWs, in Japan who were interned in close proximity to the atomic bomb detonation sites. Exposure at nuclear facilities. Veterans involved in the cleanup of nuclear contamination or maintenance of nuclear weapons facilities, including Enuitak Atoll, Marshall Islands cleanup of nuclear testing sites, 1977 to 1980. Palomares, Spain, cleanup after the 1966 nuclear weapon accident. Thule, Greenland, cleanup after the 1968 nuclear weapon accident. Service as part of the nuclear weapons program. Veterans exposed to radiation during their duties involving nuclear weapons development, testing, or maintenance. Other documented exposure scenarios. Veterans exposed during medical treatment, example, radiotherapy. Personnel working with nuclear-powered ships or submarines. The VA presumes certain diseases are service-connected for veterans exposed to ionizing radiation during their military service. Radiation exposure has been linked to several cancers, including leukemia, except chronic lymphocytic leukemia, cancers of the thyroid, breast, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, pancreas, bile ducts, gallbladder, liver, except if cirrhosis or hepatitis B is indicated, salivary gland, urinary tract, renal pelvis, ureters, bladder, urethra, bone, brain, colon, lung, ovary, multiple myeloma, lymphomas, except Hodgkin's disease, primary liver cancer. While cancers are the most common conditions linked to radiation exposure, veterans may also experience non-cancerous conditions, including cataracts, radiation-induced. Other health complications potentially linked to exposure, evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Exposure to contaminated water has affected soldiers at several locations, leading to the recognition of presumptive conditions by the VA. These conditions allow affected veterans to receive compensation and medical care without the burden of proving a direct service connection. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Timeframe of exposure: August 1, 1953 to December 31, 1987. Contaminants that soldiers were exposed to: AE, trichloroethylene, TCE, a metal degreaser; tetrachloroethylene, PCE, used in dry cleaning; benzene and vinyl chloride, toxic byproducts of industrial solvents. Contaminated water was used for drinking, cooking, and bathing, exposing service members, families, and civilians to toxic chemicals. Fort Ord, California. Timeframe is mid-1950s, early 1990s. Groundwater contamination with industrial solvents, including TCE and PCE, was discovered in the 1980s. Soldiers and civilians stationed at Fort Ord may have been exposed through contaminated drinking water. The VA has not formally designated presumptive conditions for Fort Ord, but affected veterans can file claims for service-connected disabilities linked to exposure, with individual consideration. Presumptive conditions due to exposure of Camp Lejeune contaminated water are: adult leukemia, aplastic anemia and other myelodysplastic syndromes, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, liver cancer, multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Parkinson's disease. Soldiers often face exposure to a wide variety of harmful substances and environmental toxins during their military service. These exposures can result in long-term health conditions, many of which are now recognized by the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, as presumptive conditions or service-connected disabilities. Asbestos is used in military housing, ships, and vehicle parts, example, brake pads. Common during service from the 1930s to the 1980s. The toxic exposure happens when asbestos fibers, which can become airborne, are inhaled. Associated health conditions of asbestos exposure are asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma, asthma, and COPD. Depleted uranium, DU, is used in armor-piercing munitions and tank armor. Exposure through inhalation or ingestion of DU dust. Some associated health conditions are kidney damage, respiratory disorders, possible cancers and reproductive effects. Oil well fires occurred during the Gulf War when Iraqi forces set oil wells ablaze. This produced dense smoke containing harmful toxins. Toxins created by these fires are carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. Some associated health conditions are respiratory and cardiovascular issues, skin and eye irritation, and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. These are chemicals in firefighting foam used extensively on military bases, contaminating drinking water at several U.S. military installations. Toxins associated with this foam are PFOS and PFOA, types of PFAS chemicals. Health conditions associated with exposure are kidney and testicular cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, fertility issues, Mustard gas and nerve agents. Used during chemical warfare training in World War II and beyond. Toxins associated with these gases are sulfur mustard, sarin, VX. Associated health conditions are chronic respiratory issues, skin and eye irritation, neurological disorders, environmental exposures in deployment areas, exposure to high levels of dust, sand, and particulate matter in deployment zones, example, Middle East deserts. Some of the toxins include silica dust, heavy metals. Associated health conditions are chronic respiratory conditions, pulmonary fibrosis, lead and heavy metals, exposure during construction, demolition, or ammunition handling. Associated toxins are lead, mercury, cadmium. Health conditions associated with lead and heavy metal exposure are neurological damage, kidney disease. There are several other possibilities of exposure to toxins during service. After all, much of what we operate uses fuel, flies, drives, emits toxins into the air, shoots, or explodes. If you believe your condition is related to a particular toxic exposure, locate a reliable case study and file the condition with that study. If you believe you have been exposed to toxins while in service, even if you have not been diagnosed with a medical condition, it is best to contact your local VA medical center to request a toxic screening exam. That way, if you are diagnosed with a condition, your toxic exposure risk activity has already been documented. Now, let's go over how to file a toxic exposure claim. You need to keep in mind, if you were ever denied for the condition you are going to file, even if it is now presumptive, you will need to refile it on VA Supplemental Claim Form 20-0995. If this will be your first time filing this condition, you will file on VA Form 21-526EZ. This claim will be completed and processed like any other claim. For example purposes, this veteran has never filed the conditions related to her toxic exposure before. She is filing these conditions on the 526EZ. We won't go through the entire form because Granny has already went over completing this form in its entirety on a previous video. If you need to refresh, refer to her video, Completing VA Form 21-526EZ. We will focus on page 11 of this form. I have included a few examples here for you to get an idea. Now, you will submit this claim with supporting documents either online, by mail, or through an accredited VSO. I hope this information has been informative enough for you to be able to navigate the process of filing a toxic exposure claim. I'll let Granny know we are signing off. Take care of yourself, and I wish you well.